Nintendo are back on top again, and good for them. They had a bit of a time of it after the spectacular misstep that was the Wii U, plagued as it was by marketing and branding issues which left the buying public in a state of general embafflement about the entire affair. People couldn't tell whether it was a new console, an add-on for the old one, a separate handheld console, or some kind of fancy proprietary juicing system for the super rich.
Which was a problem for Nintendo because people can't give you any of their money if they don't know what it is you're trying to sell them.
That's a problem which has largely been solved by their latest hardware offering. Everybody gets the Switch, and indeed more or less everybody went out and got one. The Switch continues to sell like some kind of warmed through ready thing, having already surpassed the lifetime sales of the Wii U in under a year. Still, if there's one practical upshot of the failure of the Wii U, it's that it finally pushed Nintendo into the mobile gaming space. Over the last couple of years, we've seen mobile iterations of popular Nintendo franchises pop up, games like Super Mario Run, a game that takes the endless runner genre and gives it a Mario spin.
Seeing Mario pop up in a mobile game is a bit like spotting French Stewart at your local laundromat. It's not where you expect to see him, and you feel like he should have better options, but you suspect that he doesn't, and honestly, it's 2016. This is about as good as it's gonna get for him.
Nintendo putting out games for mobile, even games like Miitomo, which can perhaps best be described as a nothing simulator, is something of a novelty for today's gamers who aren't used to seeing Nintendo's stable of popular characters, and also Fire Emblem, popping up on a non-Nintendo system. But as unusual as that is today, it's hardly new. Mario has appeared on a number of systems over the years, and while I could probably talk your ears off about those educational Mario games from the 90s, that's not the subject of this video, as you already know because of, you know, the title of the thing. No, we're going further back than that. Back to Mario's video game debut. Back to Donkey Kong. For geeks of a certain age, the 1980s are where it's at, and it's hard to think about gaming in the 80s without the mind turning to no. This is more like it. When it comes to gaming, the 80s undoubtedly belonged to Nintendo, unless you lived in Brazil, in which case it belonged to Sega, or in the UK and Germany, where it, let's grossly oversimplify. 80s Nintendo, right? Right. The Nintendo Famicom hit store shelves in Japan in 1985 and rolled out worldwide as the NES over the next 3 years. But Nintendo's long and storied video game history didn't begin with this childhood-defining home console, oh no. It began in the 70s, with light gun games and digital recreations of board games like Othello, eventually leading into clones of existing arcade hits like this pretty shameless ripoff of Space Invaders. In fact, most of Nintendo's arcade offerings were gently massaged knockoffs of other popular arcade games, with the exception of Head-On N, which, perhaps ironically, was a licensed repack of Sega's own Head-On 2 with very minimal tweaks.
For example, did you know that an N is just a sideways 2? Could be a 5 as well, actually. Or Z. I didn't think this through.
But all of that would change in 1981 with the release of Donkey Kong.
Menace in the building. It's Mr. Steal Your Girl. It's Mr. Steal Your Girl. Hey girl, hey girl, hey girl, hey girl, hey girl. Let go. Bottoms up.
Not only was this Nintendo's first original game, it was one of the first platforming games ever released, and the first arcade game to incorporate an actual narrative as opposed to just throwing abstract concepts at you and telling you to get on with it.
Mind you, sometimes abstract is better. We don't need to know why Pac-Man's being chased by ghosts. Dig Dug doesn't need to be justified to anybody with a narrative. What if Quicks turned out to be an allegory for gentrification? We'd all feel pretty shitty about our high scores then, wouldn't we?
Donkey Kong broke new ground and the bank, earning Nintendo $280 million in sales across the game's first 2 years alone. Like Big Hair, Bad Taste, and movies set in the 50s that featured anachronistically diegetic music, Donkey Kong was everywhere in the 80s, another popular gaming mascot for kids and arcade goers to latch onto.
Help! Help! Kids, you want to help get Donkey Kong? Give me a crunch. One more.
Donkey Kong? Donkey Kong Kong cereal.
Eventually, a home version of Donkey Kong was released. No, not that one. Not that one. Get rid of it. Home version was released for the Famicom in Japan in 1983, a launch title for Nintendo's new console, and that dropped for the NES in the US and Europe about 3 years later. This is the version that Nintendo continues to trot out for Virtual Console re-releases and WarioWare minigames, but it's not a perfect home port of the game, and crucially, it's not the only home port of Donkey Kong. It's not even the first home port, it is in fact the 6th, preceded as it was by ports for a number of consoles and home computers. The license for console ports went to Coleco, who knocked out ports for the ColecoVision, the Intellivision, and the Atari 2600, while the home computer license went to AtariSoft, who slapped the game onto a number of home computer systems including the Apple II, IBM PCs, and the Commodore 64, with varying degrees of faithfulness.
There's an interesting story involving an announced but ultimately cancelled port for Coleco's Adam home computer, and I'm not going to tell you that story. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about Donkey Kong on the Commodore 64.
AtariSoft's port of Donkey Kong hit the Commodore 64 in 1983, and stretched visuals aside, it's pretty good. It looks and sounds the part, it features the Pie Factory stage from the arcade that was famously omitted from the Famicom version due to space limitations on early Famicom cartridges, and it looks, feels, and plays just like you'd expect Donkey Kong to play. That maybe sounds like basic stuff, but considering this was an era of gaming where this was the rule rather than the exception, that constitutes nothing short of a minor bloody miracle. There are some minor issues with the controls, specifically climbing ladders is needlessly fiddly, with Mario having to stand in exactly the right spot before he'll interact with the bloody thing, but once you figure out how the ladder mechanics work in-game, it becomes intuitive pretty quickly. Mario also starts using the hammer immediately upon collecting it, as opposed to waiting until he's landed as in the arcade and NES versions. This doesn't sound like much, but it can hugely affect your play technique. You can jump up, grab a hammer, and be confidently swinging it down upon an impending underfoot barrel without fear, whereas in the canonical Nintendo versions of the game, you're more likely to be killed in this situation because it hasn't occurred to Mario to start swinging yet. That's not a dick joke, by the way. Crucially though, AtariSoft's Commodore 64 port of Donkey Kong puts the villainous gorilla on the right side of the screen, that is, the correct side, the left side. This was not always a given with home ports of Donkey Kong, which frequently put Mario's romantic rival on the right side of the screen, which is, of course, the wrong side of the screen.
Just to reiterate, the left side is the right side, and the right side is the wrong side. Good? Okay, perfect. Didn't want anybody confused about that.
Putting Donkey Kong on the right is one of those concessions that happens when you have to squeeze a game originally designed for a tall arcade display onto a monitor with a screen resolution of nothing by bugger all, and consequently have to cut the top floor off the first level. Fortunately, the Commodore 64 version avoids that particular pitfall. No, not the game. Can we go back to the game where... Yeah, cool, cheers, thanks. Once you wrap your head around the minor control issues, the stretched visuals, and the jumps that you're 100% certain you'd be able to make on the NES but can't seem to be able to stick the landing on here, you're left with a port that looks and feels decidedly faithful. Alright, the slidey ladders and the Pie Factory are missing, but considering the NES port doesn't have this stage at all, I'd say that's a step up.
So the Commodore 64 port is pretty solid and compares well to the NES version, but how does it compare to the other Commodore 64 port?
That's right, Donkey Kong was ported to the Commodore 64 not once, but twice. See, although AtariSoft got the license to port the game in 1983, another company snagged the license to release a second, separate port of Donkey Kong for the same system just 3 years later. That company was Ocean Software, a company with a reputation through the 80s and early 90s of putting out ports of popular arcade titles such as New Zealand Story, not to mention licensed games based on films and TV series such as Rambo and hit 80s cop series Miami Vice. They'd continue doing this into the 90s with games like Dennis the Menace, a forgettable licensed platformer which gained notoriety a few years ago when a pair of miserable people played it for a grand total of 16 minutes, and The Addams Family, which we covered a couple of years ago. Some of their games, including this one, were wonderful, memorable titles, and their Amiga port of Rainbow Islands is still lauded as one of the best versions of the game ever put out. But probably their most notorious contribution to gaming history is publishing this game for the Amiga and Super Nintendo in European territories. I'll try not to hold it against them when discussing their port of Donkey Kong, which came out in 1986 and was the worst thing ever made for... No, you're better than this. Come on, Ben. You've got this. Okay. It's never been entirely clear why Ocean opted to crank out their own port rather than simply republishing the AtariSoft version, so all we have is speculation. Maybe AtariSoft lost the license, or perhaps Ocean just fancied to go at porting the game themselves, but whatever the reason, there now exist two separate and distinct ports of Donkey Kong for the Commodore 64. Immediately the differences are noticeable. Ocean have gone to great lengths to try to retain the aspect ratio of the original, keeping the game board thin and narrow as opposed to the stretched to buggery AtariSoft version. Consequently, Ocean's port is arguably more representative of the arcade original while also not quite looking the part. I mean, look at Donkey Kong's face here. Look at him! He's a Cyclops! He's got one bloody great big eye and no depth perception.
Which at least accounts for his terrible aim.
Ocean's port includes a lot of things the AtariSoft port lacks. For instance, it includes the how high can you get screens missing from both the AtariSoft and NES ports of the game, and Mario doesn't start swinging his hammer until he's landed safely on the ground. They've also included the slidey ladders in the Pie Factory level, so that's nice. The other big difference between the two versions is the level order. AtariSoft's port uses the level order from the American version of the arcade game, gradually adding each level as you complete a cycle. The first cycle just has the first and last levels, the second introduces that annoying level with the spring, and the third adds the Pie Factory. Ocean's port more closely resembles the Japanese version, which just gives you all 4 levels on a loop. Arguably, this provides less variety, but it does let you play all 4 levels regardless of how crap you are, and it's still at least authentic to a Donkey Kong experience, if not the ones Americans were used to experiencing at their local laundromat or whatever. Those differences aside, this is, once again, another very competent port of the arcade original. Donkle McConkle is on the correct side of the screen, Mario moves how you'd expect him to, the music and sound is, well, it's close enough, isn't it? As Donkey Kong ports go, it's solid, and it's broadly on par with the AtariSoft version, which raises the question of why they even bothered to port this game again. The last time we looked at one game ported to the same system twice on this show was way back in 2013 when we covered the Amiga ports of Konami's NES Ninja Turtles games, which got separate, differently named ports for the European and American markets, but both of these versions came out in the same year, while the two Donkey Kong ports came out 3 years apart. And I can't find any info on which of these versions were released in which territories. All the evidence I can find suggests that the AtariSoft version did get a European release. Which begs the question, why the bloody hell does this port even exist? Was it a licensing issue? Did Atari lose the license for home computer ports? If so, how did Ocean acquire the license at a time when Nintendo had a home version of their own about to hit the market, which surely they'd want to keep that game to themselves to help promote the new system? Donkey Kong isn't even the only Nintendo game this happened to either. AtariSoft put out a Commodore 64 port of Mario Bros., the original single-screen arcade game, in 1984, and 3 years later it was ported to the Commodore 64 again, also by Ocean Software. This port, by the way, does an even worse job of justifying its existence because it's not even good. Ocean also did this with Rainbow Islands on the NES, eschewing Taito's own port for the system in favour of pumping out their own version, which more closely resembles the arcade version and is apparently the better of the NES ports available. But both ports of Donkey Kong for the Commodore 64 are, despite their minor flaws, strong ports of a classic arcade game. So really, which version you prefer boils down to whether you prefer the stretched visuals and premature hammer action of the AtariSoft port, or the imperfect pixels and functional pie ladders of Ocean's crack at the game. Although neither version is ideal if you wanted to use them to, say, fake a world record high score attempt.
Ocean's port was the last official release of a Donkey Kong game on the Commodore 64, but it's not the last time that the character appeared on the system. He'd appear again in a homebrew port almost 30 years later.
That's right, in 2014, a small team of fans knocked out a brand new Commodore 64 port of Donkey Kong Jr., otherwise known as the one where Mario tries to kill a child. It's an astoundingly accurate and thoroughly enjoyable port of the arcade original, only omitting the intermission cutscenes and a handful of sound effects. This is an impressive effort by the 3-person team of Andreas Varga, Steve Day, and Mikkel Hastrup, and those names should sound familiar. Varga was a coder on a number of games, including Horizon Zero Dawn and a few entries in the Killzone series, while Mikkel Hastrup provided music for Cannabalt, as well as the delightful Commodore 64 port of Terry Kavanagh's Hexagon, which I actually didn't even know existed until I started researching this episode, and is wonderfully charming, a charming port.
Donkey Kong never made it to the Amiga, which always irked me as a kid, but there is a shareware Amiga port based on AtariSoft's Commodore 64 version, which feels like a Jenga tower of poor decision making. I mean, if you're gonna port the thing to the Amiga, why not base it on a better port? Why not base it on the NES port? Or, hey, Here's an idea. I hear there was an arcade version. That's supposed to be pretty good. You could have based it on that. Yeah, these things always seem obvious in hindsight, don't they?
Donkey Kong would go on to appear on a couple of other systems, including the MSX and the ZX Spectrum, before making the game's last appearance on a non-Nintendo system with an Atari 7800 port in 1988. Mario Bros. Made it a little further with Amstrad and ZX Spectrum ports in 87 before hitting the Atari 7800 in 88 and coming to a final stop with an 8-bit Atari port in 1989. Since then, Nintendo games have almost never appeared on a non-Nintendo system, with the exception of the Mario Learning series, yes I mentioned it, happy now, and more recently the Wii games Nintendo have put out for the Nvidia Shield in China, but nowhere else because Nintendo doesn't love us, which would have been a better jumping off point for this episode than the mobile games, actually. Oh well. Roll credits. And that is that. Hello to all you new subscribers. I hope you enjoyed this episode of PortsCenter. If games are your thing, Mikey and I do a weekly live stream called The Antiquing Hour where we crack into an old game, although the next one we do will be Sea of Thieves, which is cheating just a little bit. I'm also trying to crowdfund a comedy drama web series about actors who are also monsters, so do check that out if you get the chance. Thanks for watching. Please like, sub, and ring that bell, and we will catch you next time.